Guys, with fall fast approaching, right now is the perfect time to be throwing around a jig. A jig is a hugely popular, versatile lure to be throwing this time of the year as fall approaches because it imitates so many different things. You can take a white one and imitate a shad. You can take a bluegill colored one, imitate a bluegill with a swim jig, or you could even go the normal way, the way that most people think about a jig, and imitate a crawfish. Those are all huge ways to catch fish right now whenever the fish are feeding up, getting ready for the winter time, and today we're going to talk about it. So I imagine most of you guys already know what a jig is. It's usually some type of lead weighted head and even tungsten nowadays with a hook and some kind of rubber or silicone skirt. Has a lot of components to it, but it is one of the greatest ways to catch fish right now in the fall. Picking out your jig and picking out what kind of forage is the first thing that you need to look for. If you can actually find a crawfish, a dead crawfish on the bank, that can give you a really good idea first of what color your jig should be. But what makes a jig really good is the trailer that you use, the soft plastic trailer. And that's what gives off most of the action. The skirt itself flares up, but those little pinchers on your crawfish imitating bait really makes that lure come to life. It really makes your jig do its work. So picking that out is one of the most important things. Figuring out what kind of action you want. Do you want it to be a subtle action with the trailer, or do you want it to be something that flaps around and really causes commotion? That's up to you to figure out. In my case, usually I try to find something that's in between. I want to have some motion, a pretty good bit of motion, but I also want it to be subtle. It needs to be subtle. It doesn't need to look too intimidating. If something looks really intimidating to a fish, I found that they usually just don't want to mess with it unless you make them react to it. But whenever I'm fishing a jig, it's not really much of a reaction strike. For some people it is. You can make them react to it by stroking it. We'll talk about that in a different video, or I'll link it down below. But today we're just going to talk about the basics of fishing this jig. Something else you need to think about whenever you're picking your jig is, what are you fishing? Are you flipping it into trees? Are you fishing rock with it? Are you fishing, somewhere in between? And they make different style jig heads for all of that, from a football jig head like this. This is more of a ball head jig, or even something more inline like this. This could be considered a swim jig. I like to pitch it into trees and stuff. It works just as well. Brush and your stuff like that. You could go on for days and days on what kind of jig head fits you, but I like to keep it basic between these two right here. I don't see a difference or a reason to change it up any and get so technique specific with it. If it works, it works. If it's not broken, don't fix it. The weight of the jig also is all up to you depending on how deep you're fishing. I don't really have a comparison or a certain size that I like to throw a certain place. I usually like to throw a heavier jig just so I can get that feel. I tend to hover around 1/2 an ounce. Some people like it a lot less than that. They want more of that finesse style jig. They actually make finesse jigs. If you're not aware of that, they're pretty light. But I like a heavier jig. I want some bulkiness to it, and I think it really helps me with the sensitivity. Then again, I don't use a tungsten jig. They do make tungsten jigs. So what do you fish a jig on? I'm not as specific with my jigging rod. Usually I use something between a 7-foot medium heavy fast to a 7'6" heavy, depending on what I'm fishing and how I'm fishing it. But my favorite in between is a 7'3" heavy fast action rod. It's kind of short, but it can still get my distance out there. It's got the backbone to set the hook. So you need some backbone. That's important. That's why I wouldn't go anything less than a medium heavy, because this hook is pretty thick. Most hooks are pretty thick on a jig unless you're using like a finesse jig. But that's the rod. It's pretty basic. If you go to the line, line's very important. Some people like fluorocarbon, some people like braid. I'm a braid kind of guy. I really like braid. But as far as fluorocarbon goes, I wouldn't use anything less than 15. Some people use 12. I like 15 as far as fluorocarbon goes. And if you're flipping like brush or timber or something, most people go up to 20 to 25. I'm not really into that. If it has to get that big, if I need something that, beefy, I'm going to use braid. 50-pound braid to 65-pound braid. I tend to hover around 50. I like the lower end of the spectrum. Then comes your reel. You really want a higher speed reel. I like a higher speed reel. The lowest I would go is a 7-to-1 reel. This is a 9.3-to-1. I use this for all my bottom bouncing baits. Stuff that needs to move really quick or get out really quick from cover, stuff like that. If I'm flipping, once again, trees or something like that, I want to be able to get those fish out of there really fast. So high speed reel, nothing less than a 7-to-1. Some people use a 6, and that's all up to you. But if you want to be sure, be 100%, make sure you can get those fish out. 7 is the way to go, or higher. During the fall, I've noticed that fish really like to get on rock. They like to get up and find those crawfish, and that's why jig is such a great option to throw around chunk rock, pea gravel, those gravel points, stuff like that. That really is a good way to catch some fish. And then there's the old tried and true, flipping it into, you know, brush and stuff. That one I don't really do as much in the fall time. I tend to think that these fish kind of school up in areas that are more open. They can get back out to deeper water whenever that cold hits. They can just go. So rocky points are absolutely amazing any time of year, but during the fall, that's one of the best places to fish a jig, or to fish just about any lure, in my opinion. So rocky points, rock. I love rock this time of year. It's hard for me not to fish rock whenever I see it during the fall, because I know that a jig can usually catch them if they're there. And since we're still in the early fall stages, there's still some fish offshore. You can actually use a jig, a bigger jig, much like this 3/4 ounce. This is a white one. This is one I use to imitate a shad. This is perfect if you're still fishing offshore. You can go fish those ledges, those humps, those deep drops, stuff like that. That's a great way to catch them right now. But once they get up, once they start to get up and feed, I'm heading straight to those rocky points. Wherever there's rock at, I'm usually trying to fish it. Alright guys, so this right here is a rocky kind of flat area. There's a channel right here, a channel swing type of bank. There's a big rocky point over there, but it gets hit so much I'm not going to go check it out right now. But this is a great area to fish a jig. So what you do is you make your cast out, good long bombing cast, or you can fish it short, whatever you want to do, and you just wait for it to fall. Usually you'll feel a little tick or something whenever it hits the bottom. Your line will go completely flat into the water. You know what's on the bottom then. And it's pretty easy. You don't have to make this a hard technique to fish. All you have to do is just kind of lift it. There's not much to it. You just lift it, give it a couple hops, make it look like a crawfish. One of the cool things about fishing a jig is imagination. You really want some imagination. You want to know, you want to try to imagine what that lure looks like down there and try to make it look like a real crawfish, a crawfish swimming around, or a bluegill, whatever you're trying to imitate. In my case, we're trying to imitate a crawfish here. So I'm just giving it a few light hops, a few light movements. I'm feeling that gravel down there. Every time I move my rod tip, I can feel it kind of bump a little bit. That tells me that I'm on gravel, that I'm on some kind of pea gravel like this, or maybe even bigger rocks depending on how big the bumps are. The more you fish it, the more you kind of realize or learn what every kind of rock feels like. With this rock, I'm using a football head style jig, so you really just want to drag it across, drag. A lot of people like to do this little number where they just kind of sweep their rod to the side and they feel it. They feel the gravel, they feel the bite if there is a bite. And that's something else we need to talk about, is the bite. Bite's pretty interesting. It's kind of like a tick kind of thing. If you've ever felt a Texas rig fish bite that, it's very similar to that, but the hook set's a little bit different. Most people have a different way of doing it. Personally, what I do is I reel up, I lift up a little bit, just like I did in the frog video. I kind of feel for that fish, and you don't want to bust that weight out of the fish's mouth, because if you just hook set it really nice and hard, then that weight will blast their mouth open and you won't get a good hook in them most of the time. So a sweeping hook set is okay, not my favorite. You just kind of have to feel it. That's the best way I've learned. I don't think that there is really an ultimate, the best way to do it. You just have to feel it for yourself, really. Guys, do yourself a favor and do not overcomplicate fishing a jig. It doesn't have to be a hard process. You don't really have to go in depth with it and really just boggle your mind. Go out and fish it. Go out and learn it. The best way to learn how to fish a lure like this is to just go and do it, find some fish, get on some fish, and then throw that lure. That's one of my favorite ways to do this. If I know that there's fish in the area, I've caught fish on other lures, I try to take something I've never thrown before and throw it in and try to catch a fish that way. So guys, that's all I've got for this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed my style of how to fish this video, and I'll see you guys right here next time.